I want to thank everyone for being here today. This is obviously the culmination of a wonderful semester of research, and this team in particular I think has done an excellent job. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. But the one comment I always like to make on all these, really for Leslie's benefit, is that we started this program about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was really out of the desire of students to have an alternative to going off campus and doing traditional internships where sometimes they end up licking stamps and stamps and more photocopies, Xerox, or whatever the term is. And so, Dan and I sat down with a few other people and put this program together. But the reality is it really only works with partners, and partners are willing to give their time and effort like you have. And we really appreciate you coming in at often an ungodly hour, as has been the case once in a while. But we really appreciate that. And I think you'll see the fruits of their labor today. They've done a lot of hard work. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and I'll be quiet, and let's hear about electoral reform.
Sorry, pardon me, I'm slightly sick, but it should be okay. I drank tea before this. Hello everyone, I'm Albert Qian.
I'm Alex Hyder.
I'm Amanda Khan.
I'm Caroline Reisch.
My name is Madeline Goossen.
My name is Araksya Nordikyan.
And we'll be presenting on the Electoral College. So I'm going to start off with our research question. What are alternative ways to allocate votes in the United States, and which of these systems is best for California? So again, I'm Albert, and I'll be giving a brief overview and introduction of Electoral College. So here's just some basic background and summary. The Electoral College was actually enacted during the Constitutional Convention of 1787. This was because they wanted to reconcile opposing federal and state interests, along with other reasons, such as giving smaller states more leverage in federal matters, as well as there's a sentiment that the general population is not educated or informed enough to make a decision on who the best presidential candidate would be. So the Electoral College was enacted as a method of kind of compromising for that. And so electors are chosen by the states as well, and the method of choosing electors differs from state to state. And so the Constitution delegates 2 electors for every Senate member of each state has, and 1 electoral vote for each House of Representative members that each state has. And so the 23rd Amendment actually gives Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes as well. And so here's a map showing basically every state and how many electoral votes each state has. And so electors are often considered agents of the public. And so they vote for the party that nominates them usually, but those that don't, very rarely it happens, and those are called faithless electors. In addition, so in California, the electors vote in a winner-take-all system in which every electoral vote, 55 actually, goes to the party that nominates them, and whichever party wins the majority of the vote in California gets all 55 votes. Every state actually does it except for 2, Maine and Nebraska. So again, California has the most electoral votes out of any state. It has 55. And how it works is that on October 1st, before October 1st of every presidential year, each party of California must submit a list containing the elector pledges for each party. And how the party does it is different for each party. For the Democratic Party, each congressional nominee and each U.S. Senate nominee designates 1 elector. And for the Republican Party, they have a preset positions, and the electors are chosen by those preset positions. And so again, California is a winner-take-all system, and if the majority party that wins, then they get all 55 electoral votes. And so now I'll be passing it off to Alex to talk about proportional representation.
All right, so like Albert said, I'll be talking about proportional representation as a option to replace our current electoral system. So first looking at how it works. So generally proportional representation is used in multi-member districts, and seats are then divided according to the proportion of the vote that each party receives. This can be done either with a closed party list or an open party list, which basically decides on if the voters can pick the party, just the party, or if they can also pick the candidates that they prefer within that party. So looking at the United States system, our president is voted for using electors, as Albert explained. And so with a proportional representation system, these electors would be divided up proportionally by each state. There's also the option to set a threshold that any party has to pass to get any seats. So let's say if this threshold is 10%, then any party receiving less than 10% of the vote wouldn't get any of the seats. But not all systems use this, so it's just an option. So going into current usage. So we obviously don't use this system in our presidential general elections currently, but it is used in some of the presidential primaries. So in the Democratic primaries, the party actually requires that all states use a proportional representation system. They require a maximum of a 15% threshold, which all of the states do use that exact 15%. So then within each state, looking at their delegates, 25% of these delegates are decided at large, so based on the proportional representation of the whole state's vote, and then the remainder are decided by district. But there are also the superdelegates and the party political leadership that aren't really included in this, and they do count towards the delegate count. Looking then at the Republican primaries. So the Republican primary doesn't really govern how each state runs its primaries, so they're all a little bit different. They recently, in 2012, created a new rule that if states want to hold their primary before March 14th, they must divide their votes proportionally. With this, they set a maximum 20% threshold. Some states use the 20, some use 10, 15, and some states don't actually have a threshold at all, so people can earn a very small percentage of the vote. For Republican primaries, there's 10 base electors for any state, plus any bonus electors that are given to states based on their party loyalty. And these are decided at large, they have to be. But there are an additional 3 delegates per congressional district, and those can be decided either at large or by congressional district based on how that state chooses to allocate their votes. So moving into the benefits and the drawbacks of a proportional representation system. So the main benefits are that it reduces the disparity between the popular vote and the share of the electors. So this would almost eliminate the possibility of what happened in the 2016 election, where someone wins the popular vote, but they don't win the presidential election. It also leads to fewer wasted votes, which makes people feel like their vote is counting more and can lead to higher voter turnout. And it encourages political parties to campaign everywhere rather than just in the states that are contested. The drawbacks are that in a general election, it could lead to a president winning with a very small percentage of the vote. If you didn't set a certain requirement, then someone could win more than any other candidate without reaching a majority. It also provides a route for extremist voters to gain support, and it can prevent winnowing in the primaries, so more of the candidates can make it further without one really coming out ahead. So looking at implementation. So the 2 places to really implement it are either in the primaries or the general election. And as we can see, it's already been implemented by the Democratic Party in the primaries. For the Republican Party to do it, the Republican Party could choose to require it like the Democratic Party does, or states could just choose to switch to it on their own. In the general election, it would have to be a state-by-state type of move. We've kind of agreed that the United States isn't going to just pass an amendment requiring all of the states to allocate their votes proportionally. So Colorado actually tried this in 2004 with a ballot initiative. It was the Amendment 36 in Colorado. It had a lot of support in the early stages, but by the end it ended up losing 34.7% to 65.2%. And the main reason that it lost and the main argument against it was that it really took away Colorado's power. So if Colorado was the only state to implement this, then their vote would almost always be split 5-4, which effectively gave them only 1 vote, and therefore no candidates would campaign there, no candidates would really pay attention to the issues that were important to Colorado. So now I'll pass it on to Amanda to talk about the congressional district model.
Hi, my name is Amanda, and I'll be discussing the congressional district voting model with you as an alternative to the current system. So a little bit how the congressional district voting system works. Every state is broken down into a number of congressional districts, and this number is based off of the representatives from the House and the Senate combined for each state, and the districts are equal to the number of electoral votes that a state receives. So every state, they do it a little differently the way that they draw their district lines. So a lot of states give that responsibility to the state legislature and kind of just they go ahead and they're allowed to draw the lines within certain bounds. But certain states, including California since 2008, have passed a bill actually that requires that a committee, an unbiased committee, be elected by voters. And it's composed of 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 independent members. And they then have the responsibility of drawing the lines. It creates a much more unbiased and more democratic way of drawing these lines. So whoever wins, whatever candidate wins the majority of votes within a certain district, they get the electoral vote from that district. And then whatever candidate receives nationwide the most congressional district votes would win the candidacy. And then for every state, those 2 extra votes from the Senate go to whoever won the popular vote within that state. So states that have used this system, in the past, Michigan and Virginia used it in the beginning of the 1800s for a little while and then proceeded into using the winner-take-all system to become uniform with the country. And then we have 2 states, as Albert said in the beginning, that currently use the system. And so in 1972, Maine implemented the congressional voting district system. They still currently use it. They've had positive feedback from it. They're advocates for the whole country using the system. And then in 1992, Nebraska implemented the system. And I was able to speak with Jacob Frick and Laura Strimple from the Nebraska Secretary of State's office, and they are the election specialists there. And they were able to walk me through a little bit of the history of the implementation. There's been a lot of positive feedback from it, except recently some politicians have been pushing back, arguing that the state should return to winner-take-all system because if you were to split the state's electoral votes, they're arguing that the state doesn't have as much of a say in the election. So it actually has only happened once in 2008 for Nebraska, and in the most recent election in 2016 for Maine that they've actually split their votes. Besides that, they have all gone to one candidate together. Both of them are smaller states, so it would be interesting to see if this were to be implemented in a larger state and to see what kind of effect that would have. Pennsylvania, in around 2010 from 2012, did have a motion to implement the congressional voting district system. I was able to speak with political consultant Bob Heckman on this issue, and he gave me a little bit of background and told me that it was introduced by the Republicans in 2010, and it had a lot of support, but it barely didn't pass through the 2 chambers of the state. For 2 main reasons. The first being that a few Republicans didn't want to stand up in support because it does have a seemingly Republican bias and they didn't want to create controversy there. The other main reason was a lot of people don't like change at all. The Constitution says that we'd use a winner-take-all system, use the Electoral College, and any type of alteration to that, a lot of people are very against, and so it barely didn't pass, and then in 2012 the motion was completely denied. So some of the benefits of the system, the first being is that it would be very simple to implement. Rather than a constitutional amendment, you're only talking about a state bill that would be passed, so it would be done on a state-by-state basis rather than having to get the whole country to move at one time. It's also more representative. An electoral vote is representing a much more magnified group of people. This would then lead to higher voter turnout. One of the main reasons that people don't vote is they say that they don't think that their vote matters. And so any way that you can get somebody to feel that their vote is more significant would increase higher voter turnout. It also would be a more accurate geographical representation of the country. You look at a voting map, you see that your Democratic Party is really concentrated in metropolitan areas and your big cities, and your Republicans are spread out in more rural areas of the country, so advocates for the system say that it would be a more accurate representation of the ways of life throughout the country. It also wouldn't be a drastic change. Like I said before, a lot of people are opposed to change, and so it wouldn't be something that would be entirely different. We would keep the electoral votes. We would use that system as well. It would just be a different way of counting it. It would also allow independents to run more with a more likely chance of winning and getting some votes. And it also would leave some state power within the states, which in the U.S. we value the balance between the federal and the state level. Some drawbacks of the system. If you look at the elections where the popular vote and the electoral vote didn't align, 2000 and 2016, if you would use the congressional district model, you actually would have had a higher disparity between the popular and the electoral vote, which obviously would be an issue. And like I had discussed before, it is a seemingly Republican bias, which is a very, very easy argument for the opposing side. The biggest issue, and what I'll discuss a little bit further, is gerrymandering. So in this picture, you can kind of see it's a visual representation of what gerrymandering is, but basically you have the same districts and then different winners depending on how you draw those different lines. So basically, right now, there's a Supreme Court going on, Gill v. Whitford, and it started in Wisconsin, and currently they're trying to decide if there should be a threshold of something called an efficiency gap. So what that is basically is a measurement of how many votes are wasted within the state. And if they pass this, it would be that any state that had a higher than 7% efficiency gap, wasted votes, their district lines would be deemed as unconstitutional, and they would have to redraw their district lines. The lines are drawn every 10 years after the census, so this would have a big effect on 2020 when we would be redrawing the lines. So a good starting point for the congressional voting district system first would be, as a country, to look at how we draw these lines. Looking at something like Proposition 11 in California to implement nationwide, where we would be able to kind of implement these unbiased committees where your gerrymandering issues would be a lot lower and it would just be a more democratic and representative way of drawing the Congress lines would be a very good first step. Lastly, it would also need to start in a swing state rather than California. So I was able to talk with Mr. Heckman about this a little bit. And realistically, your congressional voting model isn't going to start somewhere like California or Texas, where you are historically heavily blue or red. It just isn't, A, going to pass, and B, it's not really going to get anybody else on board. When you start having somewhere like Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Ohio, or these big swing states that'll really turn heads, that would be the way that we would really get this implemented. Thank you. I'm going to pass it off to Caroline.
Okay, hi everyone. Again, my name is Caroline. I'm going to be talking about ranked choice voting. And unlike the two previous systems we just described, this is actually a method for what the ballot looks like and how votes are tabulated. So it's not a method specifically for how the Electoral College votes are distributed, but it's still, I think, really relevant to this conversation about voting in general and electoral distribution. So how it works, basically in a ranked choice vote, you would have a ballot that would have multiple options, and you could rank the candidates according to your preferences. So if there's 3 candidates running, you could rank your first choice, second choice, and third choice. When it comes time to tabulate the ballots, the third choice candidate is the candidate who receives the least amount of votes, or the third candidate in this specific example, would be eliminated, and then all of their votes would be redistributed based on who those voters voted for second. So this continues until there's a majority winner. So unlike in our current system, where you only have to win by a plurality, which is just the most votes, you would actually have to surpass a 50% voter support in order to actually win the election. So this is an example of what the ballot looks like. This is from Minnesota in 2008. Here you can see this is where you put your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice. Some elections use up to 24 ranks in different places of the country, so this is a relatively simple one to look at. But overall, this is a clear example of what it looks like when you actually see this ballot in hand. So ranked choice voting is actually pretty widely used throughout our country today in cities, while not necessarily in states. So there's 4 cities in the Bay Area that use this, which are San Leandro, Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco. And then there's lots of other cities throughout the country also. You can see how this map is divided up. There's also quite a few southern states that use this for military and overseas voting, and that's because in the case of a runoff election, military and overseas people aren't able to vote in the second election because it takes too long for international mail to get back. So instead they use a ranked choice ballot, they'll rank all their candidates, and then in the second runoff election, their votes would be tabulated basically regardless, because you'll know which of their candidates were their preferences. And then there's also quite a few states that have used this and repealed it. And for the most part, those repeals have happened due to political reasons and a shift in political power. If the Democrats really were in favor of this system in this city and Republicans came to power, they generally repealed it. It's actually not because it wasn't working or because people didn't enjoy the method when they were using it. And then lastly, there's a couple places that are looking to implement this in the future. Maine just passed legislation in 2016, and they're going to implement it statewide, which will be the first statewide use of this in 2018. So some benefits to ranked choice voting: it saves money, and that's because there's not a need for a runoff election, which are usually really expensive and also have very poor voter turnout. And that's because voters don't want to show up for a second time to the polls to vote. It also creates stronger voices, because in a multi-member election, for example, it's really easy for minorities to get representation because they can create more of a coalition and get candidates that they want actually in seats. It also creates better candidate choices and more positive campaigns, because candidates have to appeal to a broader arrangement of constituents in order to get elected. If they only appeal to a specific group, they won't get those second and third choice rankings on people's ballots that are often really important to actually winning the election. It also eliminates the spoiler effect, which is a big problem in our current system, because a third-party candidate, for example, Michael Bloomberg, didn't want to enter the race in 2016 because he didn't want to take away votes from Hillary Clinton, who he shared more views with than Donald Trump. But under this method, that doesn't happen. It's really easy for an independent or a third-party candidate to enter the race. Also, it creates more accountable leaders because they had to be elected by a broader arrangement of constituents, over 50%, and it broadens participation, which I'll get into a little bit later with some statistics. So there's quite a bit of empirical support for this method. In a study that was done in the 4 Bay Area cities in 2013 and 2014, they found that independents were just as satisfied as Republicans and Democrats, which was not the case in normal plurality elections, and that's particularly encouraging as the number of independents are rising in our country. Also, there's less candidate criticism. People noticed that only 53% of people remembered candidates criticizing each other compared to 65% in plurality cities, and that's because, again, candidates have to appeal to a wider range of people, and they're not as likely to criticize the candidates who actually have a lot in common with them because they know they might get their second choice votes. That also leads to less negativity. They found that only 17% of respondents thought that the 2014 campaign was negative, which is 5 percentage points higher than in plurality cities. And it also has very high voter understanding. And this has been an argument that's been against ranked choice voting for a long time. This is what Governor Jerry Brown used when he vetoed a bill that would have passed some ranked choice voting legislation in California. This study found that 91% of voters thought that it was very or somewhat easy to understand the voting instructions. And over 80% of people in every socioeconomic group felt that way. So it's not that it's harder for some people to understand by a significant margin. And lastly, it has a lot of overall support. In the cities that use it, over 50% of people said that they liked it and thought it should be used in local elections. And they've also found that it has the greatest amount of support among people of color, young people, and low-income voters. And those voters are often the hardest to get to the polls and often the most unrepresented. So I think that's really encouraging as well. So these are some statistics that go along with that. Again, you see 90% find the ballot easy to understand. So through time, there have been arguments about the various drawbacks to this method, including the ones I've listed here. The first is administrative burdens. However, so the argument persists that it's really hard to implement the vote in these cities that don't have the right voting machines and they're not capable of tabulating these ballots. But the 4 most popular machines already can tabulate RCV ballots. And the ones that can't usually can make cast vote record data, and that's basically the data that you would scrape anyway from a ranked choice ballot and be able to use. So even if they don't have the specific machine able to calculate an RCV election, they can generally do it. Financial costs in North Carolina, they were able to implement this election with $200 total of additional costs to the state. And they also did it in 86 days, and I'll get more into North Carolina in a second. Also, the fact that it's confusing to voters, I talked about that earlier, that's not actually generally true. And lastly, in Portland, Maine, for an example, when they implemented this in 2011, they had higher voter turnout than they expected. The results were able to be turned out in 24 hours, and more than 99.8% of voters cast a valid ballot. So I think that's pretty encouraging that these drawbacks are not necessarily true. So in North Carolina, they had not the same voting machines in every part of the state, and they were still able to aggregate their data and get the results out within 24 hours. Again, the cost was only $200. They were able to educate voters basically by reaching out to local media who wanted to cover the election anyway and wanted to explain it to voters. And then they were also able to make sure that they had the right information at the precincts, because that's where it matters the most, that voters know how it works, not necessarily every voter that's might or might not vote that's sitting on their couch watching TV. So the only cost was really the $200 that went into updating the judicial guide that gets sent to everyone. Also, this election was for judicial vacancies, which are generally harder for people to vote on because no one knows what a judicial candidate is or anything about them. But it was still successful anyway. And then there was a recount, which is one consideration that people have said could be hard with a ranked choice vote. However, they got the same result when they recounted it, and they were able to do it in 2 days. So kind of wrapping up, this is already liked by many in the Bay Area, as the data suggests, and that makes me believe that it would be really successful in statewide elections across the country. It could potentially be useful in a presidential primary, which is something that was suggested to me through a phone call I had with Madeline Brown at Fair Vote, which is an organization that advocates for the use of ranked choice voting. However, it also could be significantly confusing to voters who are not used to using a ballot this way unless they had already done it first in statewide elections. So now I'm going to pass it off to Matt.
Thank you. My name is Madeline, and myself and Araksya here are going to talk about the remapping of the Electoral College that we did. So basically what we did is we looked back to 1960, so the past 15 presidential elections, and we remapped what would have happened if we used the proportional method of allocation that was described earlier. And we chose this for a couple different reasons, just practicality. Obviously, we don't have the data to do ranked choice voting reallocation. And then also the data for the congressional district model is also not readily available going back about before 1990. So that is one of the reasons why we chose proportional. It's also a widely supported model of reallocation within the United States. So just plausibility-wise, to see what would have actually happened was very interesting. So using the data from these past elections, what you do is you take the popular vote within each state and you reallocate it based on how many electoral votes that state has. So for example, for 1960 in the state of Georgia, Kennedy received 62.5% of the popular vote within that state, and then Nixon received 37.4%. So in the winner-take-all system, Kennedy won all 12 of Georgia's electoral votes. If you were to reallocate this proportionally, he would end up winning 8, and Nixon would end up getting 4. So you can see how it greatly redistributes the votes within the system. And so also within our methodology, we focus on the main 2 candidates within each election. We do take into consideration third-party candidates, but we kind of clump them together as a general third-party candidate cluster as opposed to individual third-party candidates. So you can see this is the first 4 elections that we remapped. You can see starting in 1960 with Kennedy and Nixon, as I just described. You can see that in this election in particular, neither of them actually ended up receiving a majority of the popular vote, even though Kennedy ended up receiving 303 electoral college votes. If you if you reallocate it proportionally, he just barely makes that 270 mark. And then similarly in 1964, this is more of a landslide election event, and so you can see his Johnson's great lead of 486 goes down to 320 if you do it proportionally. Yes. Similarly in 1968, which is actually kind of a case study election, we're going to be talking about in depth more. Again, no candidate receives a majority of the votes, and if you look at it as well, no candidate would end up receiving 270. So you have this issue of what happens if someone doesn't reach a majority. Similarly, in 1972, it's another landslide election, even more so than 1964, but you can see that it goes down again to 332. So then the next 4, you can see 1976, Carter and Ford. Carter just barely gets a majority of the popular vote, even though he gets well over 270. If you reallocate it, he is just above 270. And then 1980 is also another very interesting election that we'll be looking more in depth in just a moment. Reagan receives 50.75% of the popular vote, but if you reallocate this proportionally, his electoral vote actually just goes to 280. In 1984, a similar event where his landslide in the Electoral College is greatly lessened, and then again in 1988, where you have Bush and Dukakis, the percentages between the 2 vary greatly. So this is kind of the case study election of 1968. So you can see the base map is what actually happened within each state in the winner-take-all system, and then the numbers on top of it is what would have happened if you reallocate it proportionally. So the red boxes are what the Republican candidate would have gotten. The blue boxes are what the Democratic candidate would have gotten, and then if there is a green box, that would be a vote that went to a third-party candidate within that state. So you can see, for example, Texas here, 10 would have gone to the Republican candidate, 10 to the Democratic, and 5 to various third-party candidates. Not necessarily the same third-party candidate, but just a blanket third-party candidate, yes. So a couple issues that we wanted to point out for this election in particular is that it is a great example of the disparity issue of percentages between the electoral vote, the Electoral College, and then the popular vote, and you can see that in these percentages here, that even though Nixon won 43% of the popular vote, he ended up getting 56% of the electoral vote within the Electoral College. If you redo this proportionally, they match much better, the first and last graph. And then similarly, you can see that there's a rise of a viable third-party candidate if you reallocate proportionally, because instead of receiving 9% of the third-party vote, you can get 15 if you do it proportionally. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, this is a great example of no candidate winning a majority of the vote or 270 electoral college votes, either if you do this proportionally. So that would be an issue you would have to address.
Well, thrown into the house.
So then similarly, we're going to look a little more in depth at 1980. Same rules apply with the boxes and the colorings. I wanted to highlight this election again because it deals with the issue of disparity between percentages of the Electoral College votes and the popular vote, especially in a landslide election. You'll see that's heightened even more. And then this also shows the issue of third-party candidates, because even in this election where it was considered an electoral landslide, 24 states would have ended up giving at least 1 vote to a third-party candidate. So you can see here, this graph is even more heightened, but Reagan winning 51% of the electoral vote, or the popular vote, he ended up getting 91% of the electoral vote, which just
That's
clearly doesn't match up.
amazing.
There's something wrong there. And then the third-party candidates who received 8% didn't get any electoral votes. And you can see 41 of Carter's went down to 9% in the Electoral College. So if you reproportionate or reallocate it proportionally, you can see the numbers match up much better, with Reagan getting 52% of the popular vote and then 6% going to third-party candidates. We're going to pass it off to Roxy to talk about the next couple elections.
Hello again, my name is Araksya, and I remapped the 50 states from our 7 most previous elections, so from 1992 to 2016. Same patterns are really seen throughout. So in 1992, and I'll go ahead and emphasize a couple of stats between each one, we see that Clinton won the presidency with 202 electoral vote difference from 370 compared to 225 that he would have gotten if we reallocated proportionally. The proportional vote that was allocated, the difference then would have been 22, so rather than him winning with the 202 electoral advantage, he would have only won with 22. And lastly, in 1992, we do see that the third-party candidate has received the most electoral college votes ever, which is, yes. So in 1996, Clinton won with 220 votes. Proportionally, he would have only won with 38 votes, and then the third party was also seen earning at least 50 electoral votes. In the year 2000, the popular vote and the Electoral College, as we know, did not correspond with one another. Bush ended up winning, although Gore had the popular vote, with only a 48% compared to a 47%, so it was a really close election. And he won by 5 electoral votes. Surprisingly, if we were to reallocate it proportionally, he would have lost, Gore would have again lost with 6 electoral college votes this time around. In 2004, we see that it was again a close election. The popular vote percentage is less than 3% here. Electorally, Bush won with 35, and then proportionally, the margin decreases dramatically to 14. Continuing on to 2008, we see that this is the only year that a third-party candidate would have not received any electoral votes. And then similarly, the margin for Obama winning would have went from 132 electoral votes to only 38 against McCain. In 2012, from Obama again winning with 126 electoral votes, Obama would have only won with 13, and then both times Obama was actually able to reach 270 majority, which was not seen the further back we go that Madeline spoke about. And then lastly, the 2016, our most recent election. Surprisingly, this is the only year that the outcome would have differed if we were to allocate the electoral votes proportionally throughout every state. So no candidate, neither Trump or Clinton, reached the 270 majority, and then Clinton would have won Trump by 8 electoral votes rather than the 77 that Trump won Clinton. That is what happened. So again, a case study looking into, closer look into 1992. Again, the states shaded in the colors are what the candidates actually, that means they won the overall state. But as you can see in California, for example, for 1992, a Republican candidate would have gotten 18, a Democrat 25, and a third-party candidate would have actually been able to allocate at least 11 electoral votes. Same in Texas and also in Florida, which are pretty outstanding. And then all years, so again, here is the pie charts for this year. As we can see, the popular vote and the proportional remapping almost look identical, whereas the electoral vote in this year, Clinton won 43%, but took 68% of the electoral college votes, whereas Bush had 37 and ended up with 31 when you use the current system that we have today. For the case study of the 2016 election, as we can see, there are the green boxes that allocate to third-party candidates that they might have received. So, 21 states during this time would have actually given a third-party candidate electoral votes, and 12 states, surprisingly, are actually split between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to dividing up their electoral votes. So we do consider very few states swing states, but when we do it proportionally, it's really interesting to see that 12 states are actually right in between, splitting up between Republicans and Democrats. Again, just a different visual. The popular vote really looks very similar to proportional remapping rather than the electoral vote, where almost 57% is taken by Trump rather than the 45 that he earned when it comes to the popular vote. So the evaluations based off the remapping that Madeline and I conducted, rounding to whole numbers can really skew the data. For example, when you take the percentage and the percentage of an electoral vote based off the popular vote that each system had, we do have to round up. So if a candidate had 4.6, we had to round it up to 5 electoral votes, whereas if a candidate had 3.4, we kept it at 3. So there is a disparity between the numbers there. And another problem is that candidates, several actually, did fail to reach 270 mark, so it does require working of the current system. What would happen then? Do we send it back to the House to make that decision, or is there another system that needs to be implemented in order for them to run off again? Several of the benefits that are mentioned is that elections are more closely resembled to popular vote. In the pie charts, as we saw, there wasn't much of a difference. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart based on compared to electoral vote, where there was a huge disparity between numbers. And the proportional model also allows for viable third-party candidates to actually have a chance, which surprisingly hasn't happened since the, since 1853. Millard Fillmore was actually the only president that was not Democrat or Republican that won the presidency. So that's really interesting to take into account. And then lastly, increases competitiveness, which overall I think is needed in a diverse nation like the United States. So now I'll go ahead and pass it off to Albert to speak about the survey that we conducted.
Hello again. So my name is Albert, and we conducted a public opinion survey to gauge China's public knowledge and preferences regarding how much they know about the Electoral College and what preference they would have for the alternative systems we discussed previously. So I had the pleasure of meeting with Professor Christian Rose, an associate professor at the USC Dornsife College of Arts and Sciences. He specializes in political methodology, campaigns, and elections. And so I met with him and talked about the survey and what questions would be most efficient and how to design them. So here he emphasized the importance of survey demographics. Given that the large majority of survey respondents were USC students, we emphasized that to break down the demographics in order to get a more accurate result and not skew responses. And so, as you can see here, the most important demographics were their age, ethnicity, education level, and average household income. So here, as you can see, the majority of respondents were ages between 18 and 24, with a few being 24 to 39, even less being 40 through 59, and none at all being above 60 years old. Here, as you can see, the majority of ethnicity, as people identified with, were white, next being Hispanic, Latino, and Asian. The next one being of other races, and very few being Black or African American. Here's a chart showing the responses of how much education the respondents have completed. Overwhelmingly, we see that some have completed some college credit with no degree, a few have completed associate's, bachelor's, or master's degree, and a few had also completed only high school education. And here's a breakdown of the average household income of the respondents. As you can see, a majority had over $150,000 or more in annual income, and the rest are pretty evenly distributed across the income ranges. And so next I'll be discussing the survey questions themselves. Basically, we're gauging how much background knowledge and education the survey respondents had regarding the Electoral College and what preferences they had for the actual alternative systems discussed. So we use the Likert scale here, also known as the 1 through 5 scale, which it being 1 being not likely at all to vote in a presidential election, 2 being unlikely to vote in a presidential election, 3 being neither likely or unlikely, 4 being likely, and 5 being very likely to vote in a presidential election. As you can see, an overwhelming majority responded 5 as in being they would be very likely to vote in a presidential election given the chance. Again, we use the Likert scale. This slide in particular is interesting given that here we asked how familiar they would gauge themselves to be regarding the Electoral College, and surprisingly, a majority of respondents responded with being very familiar with the Electoral College. However, studies have shown that oftentimes the population doesn't know what exactly the Electoral College entails. In fact, during the general election, studies have shown that when voting, people think it's a direct ballot, which means they think they're handing a direct vote for president or vice president, rather than they're handing a vote for their electors to vote for president or vice president. So you can take this slide with a grain of salt, because we are asking the surveyors to gauge their own ability in knowing how much they know about the Electoral College. And so here we're asking whether or not they think that it's fair that California actually designates the electors for them based on the party. And so as you can see, a majority of respondents surveyed said that no, they don't think it's fair that that California's parties choose the 55 electors that vote on their behalf. So lastly, we have a breakdown of the 4 systems we discussed, except for winner-take-all, which is the current system we have in place. And we asked them to rank their choices in terms from most fair to least fair. So this is on a scale of 1 through 4. So as you can see, 4 is like the maximum you can have in terms of the rating you have on this scale. And so as you can see here, the proportional system was ranked the most fair. Congressional districts was ranked 2nd. Winner take all was ranked the 3rd, and ironically, the last one was ranked choice voters. Out of all the surveys, they ranked choice as the least fair in terms of how fair they would think electoral votes being distributed would be. And so we actually gave a brief background of each system before, so they knew what they were voting on. And so we have 3 policy recommendations. This is our final slide. I'll leave it to Amanda to discuss the first one.
Hi everybody. So our first policy recommendation, going back to a little bit what I talked about, is restructuring the way that we draw our district lines nationwide and kind of making it a universal system of electing an unbiased committee with that kind of standard of having 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 independents that are elected by citizens in order to vote, regardless of what voting system you're implementing, even just for statewide or local elections, creating a more democratic, more representative, and a fair way of doing this, avoiding gerrymandering issues, being politically advantageous to certain groups over another. This would kind of just create a much more level playing field and a much more democratic way overall of kind of looking at elections in general. Hand that off.
Yeah, so secondly, we think that ranked choice voting should be used for all local and state elections across the nation. We think that it makes elections more fair, it makes candidates less critical of each other, and it makes people enjoy the process a little bit better and not as overly fed up with the system, which people get when they're hearing negative campaign ads and when they feel like candidates aren't necessarily listening to what they want. So while, again, this isn't an alternative to the Electoral College specifically, I think it would solve a lot of the issues we have with people's perspectives on what it means to cast a ballot in general.
Yes. And finally, as the survey pointed out too, we'd be utilizing proportional representation in the general election. So we would start off with utilizing it in primary contests, and the Republican Party would either switch entirely to proportional representation, or each state would switch to this method. So we would start with the coalition of swing states as listed here: Florida, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina. And if no one reaches 270 electoral votes as needed currently to win a presidential election, then a candidate with the most electoral votes overall would win the election. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
All right, thank you so much to Leslie for working with us.
Yay, Leslie. All right,
Good
that
work.
was wonderful. You guys all did a great job. Why don't we make this a little more casual? Bring this chair over there, and we'll have you guys sit around the table, and we'll make it more of a round table rather than have you stand up there and look strangely awkward.
Cool, so now what we're gonna do is open it up for questions between yourself. I know I have some questions too, so
We'll go ahead and
Yeah,
turn
we'll
it over
start
to
with you,
Leslie in
Leslie.
terms of comments,
All
critiques,
right.
or questions you have about this, and we'll go from there.
All right, great job. Really, really well done. I'm interested in your 270 because the Constitution does say if they don't hit 270, it automatically goes to the House. Are you all recommending that that be amended from the Constitution if they, because that's a big hill to climb also. So in some of these cases, they would have gone to the House. That's how it goes. So there is no giving it to the highest total winner. They have to hit 270. So that is an interesting question if we run into more of a chance with proportional voting. However, I do think they'll campaign differently. So it's hard to say. We can say that based on the old data, but the new data would be very, and that is an unintended consequence for sure for proportionals, that you end up going into the House all the time. But I think the research was amazing. I was interested in your 2016 swing state slide. Can you go back to that?
Forward, there you go.
Okay, walk me through this if you can, just one more time, because I found it really interesting and how
Can you see?
sort of, yeah, I can, thank you.
You would like me to?
Well,
walk
I'm
you
just
through?
interested in the swing state and sort of how you, I wanted to look at the slide itself. I mean,
Okay.
because no one ever thought of Minnesota as a swing state, okay?
Mhm.
So it's sort of
Right.
interesting, these odd
Mm.
states that pop up that are swing states now. And I don't see Ohio, you know? So I found that a really because, you know, Ohio always ends up Florida swing state. You hear the same ones over and over again. And with this case study of 2016, none of those.
Right. So what I did was on my Excel while I was inserting the numbers for these, I actually started counting because I realized I was putting in the same numbers for a lot of them. So I decided to go back and actually count how many of the states have split their Republican and Democrat vote, and then how many are, although their third-party candidate numbers most of them are ones, but do they vary?
And those are Bernie Sanders, is that what I'm telling? Now, what, Gary
Not
Johnson?
necessarily.
Oh,
Any
okay, so it could be
third
Gary
Any third-
Johnson.
yeah.
Right.
Okay, that's right, it's lumped. I just couldn't tell from your
Spotted
key-
eagle.
Yes.
Yeah,
would be in
spotted
there.
maker, yeah. So that guide on the right, those color codes don't really correspond though, is that correct? Are
Those
you just
correspond
showing
to the
all
map
the?
underneath.
Yeah,
If
so
you-
see how there's blue back there on California? That's
Yeah.
what actually happened, right? So we went Dem to Hillary, but the boxes on top of them are
What would
what
have
would have
happened
happened
if
if
you
you
But
allocated
you can't
so
see because
proportionally.
none of these people
Right,
actually
these
got
don't
states.
really count because
So
they're not
that's
there.
why.
Because
nobody won that.
underneath the map, like
Does
if
that
you were
make
to
sense?
move the boxes
Right.
that are over Texas, you'll see that there's a little circle with, who was, I think Powell got one state there.
Yes, right,
There's a
no, I
little-
remember those, that
There's a
had the
little
oddball,
circle with
yes.
with the
Okay,
Powell,
okay,
that's
so
what
that's
that
what you're
is.
doing
Yeah.
here. Okay, I didn't, because I couldn't figure out the graph on the side, but, because I remember Spotted Eagle and seeing those on there. So the green could be Gary Johnson or write-ins or whomever. Okay, okay, great. That is a fascinating map for 1,000 reasons, but really, really interesting, really. I found the whole, going back to 1960, amazing.
The 68 election's very interesting.
Yeah, 68. Well, and also 92, because, Ross Perot pulled in 19% but didn't get one electoral vote, which
Yeah.
really, if you think about it, is sort of shameful, not,
Yeah.
however you may feel about him. 19% is a heck of a lot of votes, and to not be even represented in the game. I'm interested in just all of your gut feeling about the whole exercise, and whether you think, and I got a million questions, but okay. Whether you think overall the climate is right for this change now, for states to look at how they do it. Do you think people are open to it, or do you think it's just a complete uphill battle? And I want each of you to answer the question if you can. I'll start with you, Albert.
Well, sorry, I'm still sick.
Should it get better in the last half hour?
So I think that right now would be. Wow, my voice is not cooperating. Okay, I think that right now, out of all times, would be like the best time to enact the system because of the recent controversy surrounding the presidential election, and as Araksya pointed out in her graph, how the result would have actually changed given a proportional representation allocation of electoral votes. But I do think that, since I did talk with her super professor Christian Gross about the possibility of this actually happening, and he said that it's hard because implementing in California first would be really difficult, and and then it would only really work out if we had like multiple states implementing it at once. So we'd be fighting a battle in like multiple states right now. And it also does, some of the systems do heavily favor the Republican Party. And so that would be another aspect that we have to even out. And so I do think that now would be a better time than ever in history, but it's also still an uphill battle.
Imagine the dynamic, by the way, if you have a bunch of big states that are willing to do it. Now all of a sudden you're empowering Utah and Hawaii
Right.
and and North Dakota, because they're not gonna
Not to
switch.
budge,
And their
yeah.
differential is probably 1 or 2 or 3, maybe 5. All of a sudden North Dakota's the big dog.
Yeah, right.
Right?
The battleground guy.
So I think
Yeah.
it's an all or nothing. I think
Yeah.
everyone buys in.
You get all the
Or
secretaries of
no.
state to come together.
Yeah, I think it's
yeah.
the only way you can do it.
Yeah, I know. Because as you get more into the weeds, you realize the dynamic shifts.
Or create an incentive, the government to create an incentive for these,
make the
financially
switch.
to make the switch, right? And just say, look, you're not gonna get X number of dollars for transportation, millions and millions of dollars, like they did with the driving.
Right.
Or I mean, not driving, but the DUI
DUI,
levels
yeah.
and stuff like that.
No, I mean, the pressure's gonna have to be
Yeah.
enormous.
Yeah, I actually don't think that currently there is enough of a push for it. I think that the push would have to come more from the people, and I don't think that the people are going to push more for it until they see more of these elections, different
Right.
types being used in cities. Because I think once they see them being used successfully in cities, they might say, okay, well, why aren't we using these for the national election? I kind of used the national popular vote like multi-state coalition. I'm
Mhm.
trying to remember the exact words of what
The
they're
state
calling it.
compact.
Yes, the
Yeah.
state compact, as like a indicator of if states would be willing to agree to allocate their votes proportionally, because it would obviously have to be multiple states, not just one.
Mhm.
And there's only 10 states and DC signed on right now. So I think that if more people within the state started pushing for their states to sign on to that, that could kind of be an indicator that they might be willing to agree to switch their votes to proportional allocation. But I don't think that right now.
The interesting thing about the state compact, though, is that it is the ultimate in, like, no representation. Truly, I mean, your state goes 100% with the popular vote, and your entire state popular vote might have been in the opposite direction.
Right.
I just think, to me, it is a complete slap in the face of any kind of representative. That's, I think, the problem with it. It's fine for California to say that, because it generally goes in one direction all the
Right.
time, but if you have a real true swing state, boy, that's tough. And I can't imagine the California voters having been thrilled to go with the Bush popular vote when they did, you know, I think it'd go one time, and that would be it. And I think people might dump out. Okay, Amanda?
I think you have a lot of different sides to this. So you have people, you know, even in the survey, and that have said before that they're unhappy with the current system. They don't think it's representative. You then have people who don't want any type of change at all, and then you have politicians who are going to be really hard to budge and aren't going to necessarily want a change depending on if it's favorable to them. Like you mentioned, it's going to change, you know, campaign strategies and all sorts of things. So it's kind of hard. You're playing this balancing game of different wants and needs. I do think that in order for it to happen, as Professor Auerbach said, it would need to be, if not majority all at once, a large majority of states to happen, because you need these swing states to start doing it. You get, you know, bigger states even like California or Texas or New York, and it doesn't really mean anything. You would need everybody to do it at once, and if you don't, then there is that disparity of certain states coming up where you know, like North Dakota, where you've never had before. So, and I also think it helps, you know, like when we look at visual representations like Madeline showed us, of looking at how high the disparity is between a popular vote and an electoral vote, and you look at that and it's like, oh my gosh, that's incredible, but as I don't think that the general citizen knows that. So I think if everybody were to be educated and were to be able to see and understand that, I 100% think that we could be able to move towards that, but because the general population doesn't understand that, I do think that it makes it a lot more difficult to do.
I think very similar. I would say if there is a time, it's probably now, but I think education is a huge piece to that. And I think there's not enough understanding of what the Electoral College even is, let alone why it's perceived to be unfair. I think that's getting a more popular viewpoint with time now. But I think people need to understand, people need to see the disparity between the Electoral College and the popular vote to be able to want to do something about it, and they don't. For example, when you think about that, you think about 2000 and 2016, but you don't think about all those other elections where there was a massive disparity as well.
Oh, that 1980 Reagan graph was just incredible.
Yeah. And I also think that, for me, what's encouraging about proportional representation is that it, based on the old data, which, again, the campaigning would probably be different, it doesn't change the result very often, only in the unique 2016 election, but it changes your perception of whether it's fair or not.
Exactly.
And I think that's a massive thing for our country, and that's really the issue and the sticking point, is that it's not perceived as fair or perceived as equal, even though if the result is the same the most of the time, but it looks visually, or you have the data to back up why it is representative of our country. And I think that's an important step, but again, I think people would have to really understand that in order to want to change it, and I don't think they do right now.
I feel like everyone said everything really well so far.
Yeah.
I'm just nodding, yeah, that's great. But I love the point that you made about how it doesn't actually change a lot of the results, but the disparity between it just seems fair. And
Right.
I think that's really the base issue with how it is done nowadays, is that whether it is fair in practice doesn't seem fair,
Right.
that
No,
perception of it, yeah. But I do think, the climate now is one of the better times to try to do this, via ballot initiative, more starting at the base as opposed to, doing it starting, let's say, in the federal government, an incentive program, like you were saying. I don't think that would happen now. But I think there's enough.
So what would have to happen?
Voter groundswell, I think.
Yeah.
Have people just have to show those pie charts.
Exactly.
So if I'm
Post them in some way.
Donald Trump and I have all the reason in the world to say we don't need change, my argument would be, it's only affected one race,
Right,
even
it's
though it
the
was
same.
my race, but it affected one race in 60 years. This is ridiculous. Why
He's
would we
been
talk
on
about
record
this?
saying he
It's not
doesn't believe in the
broken.
Electoral College.
Well, he's
So-
on the
But
record.
it's
saying-
saying a lot of things.
Not that that matters at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where, but I mean, you could see someone who's against it going, look, it's working 99% of the time. Or-
I do think, and I want to get your final
Yeah, of course.
comments too, and then I have one quick question to ask, and I will let you guys go. I
No,
keep
no,
your
no,
all
no,
my-
I have some
Yeah,
questions too,
no,
actually.
just your thoughts on timing and if you think it's even possible to move this.
So yeah, I definitely agree with all my peers. I was actually surprised. I thought that while calculating these, all of these were gonna flip. We were gonna see the opposite candidate win. And it wasn't flipping until the very last one.
Yeah.
And I actually had to check my calculations several times because I just couldn't believe it. I was, oh my gosh, it actually flipped. But I definitely agree. I think voters don't, and I've worked on, getting the vote out and, campaigns and stuff. They don't understand at all. And for my research paper actually, there was a study done and a huge majority, like 80% of people thought that the Electoral College was where candidates would go to like become certified or to go learn how to run.
Oh, was
Because
actually
they-
an academic institution?
Like
It
it's
was-
an
it was
actual
an actual-
college. That's awesome.
It was so I
That's
definitely
so
think
Good job
it's,
there.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
so I
Wonder what state
definitely
he's
think
in.
it needs
Yeah.
to start from educating voters, and if we
Yeah.
can get them up and educated quickly, then this might be the time, but I don't know.
I mean, do you think it would
It's like a
increase
lot.
voter turnout if people thought actually,
Oh, absolutely.
I could bring in one or
absolutely.
two electoral votes
100%.
possibly
I
for a
think that the
candidate?
best visual of that is if you go to those pie charts, it's
Yeah.
like look at how.
Or if you go back to 80.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's insane. I do have a couple of questions for you guys though. One being, can you go forward to the 2000? I'm a little confused by this. Go back to the 2000 election with Gore and Bush. Yeah. So I'm
Okay.
only confused because I thought the argument that y'all were making was that the popular vote is more representative to proportional allocation, and so here Gore wins the popular vote, and that's the whole controversy. But then he would ultimately lose.
Yeah, but look how many,
Because of the third party.
Because of the third
Yeah.
party. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, typically, it is more reflective of the popular vote, but because it isn't the popular vote, it's popular vote by state.
By state.
It
Right.
can slightly switch like that.
Okay. That's just it was what my brain
Yeah.
was
Because
confused.
Which
it's
is like
proportional
92
by
also.
state. is
Yeah,
the thing.
exactly. Okay, cool. So I was curious about that. And then we talk about how things would need to change if we go to proportional just because of getting to the 270 and how not everyone has done that. But I don't really feel like I got an answer from you. Is that constitutional amendment? Is it always going to go to the House? Like, what, in your opinion, would the solution to that be?
I mean, the House is the default now. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of, you can just think about flat out other ways to do it. You can keep it at the House. You can do a runoff between the top two. You could do just whoever gets the majority or the most vote, whether that is a majority or not, or I'm sure there are other
And
ideas.
that,
of
but
how to
if
do it.
ultimately it had to be changed in the Constitution.
Right, that would be if
That's
we
just- yeah.
differed from the 270 going to the House, that would be a constitutional amendment.
Okay. And
Which, if it becomes an event that happens more and more, that might be easier to change.
Right.
I think
Yeah.
that's a good point. That's
So-
a good-
So then, you guys also talked about doing RCV voting in cities across the country.
Mhm.
How would you go about implementing that?
So, my suggestion for that was first bringing it to Los Angeles, because I think
Great.
it already has a lot of support in cities in the Bay Area, and Los Angeles is also a large, diverse city, obviously very different than cities in the Bay Area. But that research is here, and it's available to us, and those policymakers are here, and they're available to us. So I think that would be a good step. And after that, I think California as a whole should implement it in statewide elections, and to me, that would set a really good example for the rest of the country to do it. Once Maine is doing it and has the data to back it up, and this data becomes more widely used, I think it would be able to spread a lot faster. But I do think it takes a major powerhouse state like California or Texas or somewhere else to do it first before it spreads.
For statewide.
For statewide
Yeah.
elections.
And you'd want to use it, would you, and then just so I'm understanding, would you want to use RCV then in primaries for presidential?
So that wasn't our recommendation in the end because, and this is something I talked about in my research paper, I think that's a much more down the line step.
Okay.
And I think that's too confusing
Yeah.
to be changing the way voters vote for candidates and then the way votes are distributed all at once. I don't think that, I think our country is probably ready for some sort of electoral change. I think that's way too dramatic. And if cities and states could become familiar with this method first and enjoy it that way, it could later be very successful in a presidential primary, especially because of the large number of candidates running and how contested they usually are and all those things. But it's to me, and I think that this is something we all talked about, it's too complicated all at once.
So do you?
Can I
sorry.
piggyback on your?
Yeah, go ahead.
Recount,
Yeah.
I would be so worried about a presidential
Absolutely.
recount on ranked choice, it would just, my God,
Yeah.
you thought 2000 was bad.
Well, that's fine.
So-
I mean, that's my big fear, but I think statewide, totally doable.
Yeah,
you
I
know?
agree.
And I just think in primaries, like if the GOP had done it this time with 17 candidates.
Yeah, that's what I
You
was
wouldn't
saying.
have
So-
Trump as your, you know, you just wouldn't have, I mean, it just wouldn't have happened.
So, for example, some of the
To your point,
cities that do
yeah.
this now have a top 2 rule, so only the top 2 candidates are considered. After the first tabulation, the top 2 candidates with the most are kept in place, and then all the other votes are redistributed. So that would be a very simple law that could be enacted to kind of eliminate the recount. So that would be one kind of solution, but again, really complicated to do that, although cities that have used like a 24 or 16 person ballot haven't necessarily had trouble with it, but obviously that's on a much smaller scale than being statewide or in a presidential
one of the
primary.
problems with, these additional elections is we sort of get election fatigue by the voters. And we see it here in Los Angeles, half the people don't even know when they're supposed to vote.
Yeah.
And they really only go out when it's a meaningful, up ballot vote
Right.
with the president or, so I
Yeah,
wonder if
runoffs
this is
are
gonna
like-
add
yeah,
on
yeah.
to that fatigue, it's okay.
Well, no, it would eliminate runoffs.
But it eliminates
Oh,
the
that's
number of
true. Yeah,
elections,
yeah.
so yeah.
Which
I
are
think
also-
it's going to the polling place and saying all of your preferences
Correct.
at once
Yeah,
instead of
you're
having
right.
to be called back, which a lot of the data supports that people like that a lot better. And it's really
It's less expensive.
It's less expensive for the state also, and states have spent millions of dollars and cities doing runoff elections when they could just do it all at once.
Was there any, did you come across any research of folks that talked about when you do ranked choice voting, and this is, God, I did this like 7 years ago in college, so I totally might be lying when I say this to you, but I remember that myself coming across research that sometimes there's a way to like game the system of like if you vote, if you want someone to win to actually then put them second or third, is that I don't really remember what I did.
So
but-
I asked the people at Fair Vote about that, and they said no, there's
Okay.
no way to game this system, although I understand what you're saying in that argument. I didn't come across that
Okay.
in any of my research, and I don't think there's
Too many people
unfortunately,
thinking it
there's
that
too many
way.
people think that, or a way to track necessarily
No.
if people are doing that. So that's probably why that research doesn't exist. But I did specifically ask them that question, and they
Okay.
said we found it isn't gameable, and people don't feel that way about it.
But what,
Yeah.
do you have to rank them? Can
You
just
don't.
do one?
No.
You don't, but so that's also an interesting point when I was asking them. So people are casting valid ballots, but are they actually using the method? And they said their data shows that people are either using all their options or at least 3 of them. So people are actually not only using the ballot validly, but comprehending what they're supposed to do when they get it and showing up prepared enough to rank their candidates that way.
Sometimes they will do the bullet vote where they get everybody to just vote for one person, and that
Right.
one vote then is incredibly powerful because there is no second
That's
vote.
what it is.
So it's called bullet voting. And I
Yes.
don't know if that, with the ranked choice, would be an issue, but it would certainly be something to think about.
And then so also just I'm understanding your policy recommendation. So for you'd use proportional in presidential elections, and electors would be decided through the
Proportional.
proportional.
Popular vote, yeah.
Right, okay.
By state.
Okay. But the methods that the parties would use would be the same across?
Well, we recommended that
That's for the
the,
primaries.
primaries.
yeah, that's for the primary. So Alex
So
recommended
the
that.
Democratic primary already uses it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the Republican Party does not.
Okay.
So we
for
recommend
the
that the
general.
Republican Party
For
moves
the
to that.
primaries.
Right, but for the general, it really wouldn't matter.
For the general,
if
it
you
doesn't
picked them or
Right,
not,
yeah,
and it doesn't
because
matter who
it's
picks them,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Okay.
Which is also the beauty of that,
Right.
Yeah.
right, is you kind of get over the largesse issue and the payback and,
Yeah, so there's really, I mean, what I'm kind of come to understand is there's really no, the way that we have our country set up, there's no really smart way to get rid of the electoral college. You have
Not
to
that someone has thought of already.
Yeah,
Yeah, these are all ways to work with
with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, it's
Yeah.
more you're working with it
Yeah,
than you are
because
getting rid of
it's
it.
what it is.
Right.
Do you see the viability for a constitutional amendment with the whole 270, or do you see that it's just nobody? I don't know how
Like
much.
down the line, yes.
Okay.
Right, like I think Madeline
if-
said.
Yeah.
Sorry.
If we were using proportional representation, then there would be a need for it.
Right, if
it
it,
just
if it were to
happens
consistently occur, if there was a call for it, you may be able to do that, but right off the bat, you're not gonna be able to just.
Well, and I think you're
Introduce
gonna
a
have some,
constitutional
really have some level of organization that comes out and says with every election, this is what happened, this is what happens on a proportional,
Right.
this is a wrong decision because of this. And if you see that time and time and time and time again, then people start to go, oh, okay, I think we got an issue. But just sort of throwing it out there, I mean, I think it just takes a lot of support in order to move this mountain, because, you know, I think you're gonna have a lot of people going, well, seems to work in the
Right,
playoffs.
works
Yeah.
most of the time.
Well,
Yeah,
whenever someone
right.
supports it, the problem is that people politicize that. and they say
Absolutely,
that it's a partisan thing.
I mean, there's a lot of
Like the
politics that's involved
Colorado
in this.
2004 thing, it was crazy. All of the arguments against it were like, oh, well, this money is coming from California, so it must be a Democratic thing.
Right.
And it was crazy.
Well, it's interesting too, because Amanda, on the congressional district model, everybody says it favors the Republicans. You've got one of the most Democratic states doing it, right?
Right.
So it is kind of, it
Right.
is sort of interesting that people say it's really a Republican.
Well, it's an easy argument, because
Yeah.
if you look at it, you know, like I said, congressionally, it does, because geographically,
Right.
they are more spread out. Your Republicans are more spread out, so they are able to get more districts because most of your Democrats are concentrated into districts. But somewhere like Maine, who's doing it, you know, likes it, supports it, it's worked, and so it's kind of just an easy argument from the opposition.
Do you think Nebraska will stick with it?
I do for a while. You know, they've had it for a really long time. You know, so it's been 25 years now. And this is really, you know, there's always been some pushback here or there. I think that it's because they're seeing that splitting their vote, I think, scares them. Especially because they only have such few votes, you know, that they think that their voice is louder that way. But the place that it's coming from is not really the state as a whole. It's from certain politicians who would be advantaged by if they returned back to the winner take all.
Right.
So it's not necessarily coming from a completely genuine place.
Well, I imagine we could talk for
Can
several
I ask
hours.
one
and
last question
you
to
certainly
Alex?
can.
I'm sorry. When you looked back at those that had proportional and then they dumped out and went to winner take all, was the rationale to give them a bigger piece of at the table? Was that why they wanted
in
to
the
do it?
cities,
Mm-hmm.
so it was all cities that were doing it, and all
Oh,
of them
cities,
stopped
okay.
in the 50s and 60s because of the Cold War and arguments that it helped extremist parties, so it was helping the communists.
Oh, interesting.
So it was really easy to scare
Oh, like
people
an
into saying, you're
anti-communist.
helping the communists by doing this, so you have to switch back to winner take all.
Right.
And that,
right.
I think more and more were doing it, and then once they all stopped for that reason, then they all stopped.
And it's funny, because now we are just dying for third party and people who aren't so politicized to come into the
Right.
mix, and we have no way to really get them into the system.
It's just
We've
that
thrown out
sometimes
the
those
model
third
that actually
parties
would've
are
allowed it.
extremists,
Right,
so
right.
that's the argument against it.
Right, right. Did you find any but states did it early on in the 1800s, had proportional, or always been winner take all?
I didn't look into how the states allocated it way back
Prior,
then.
yeah, interesting thing just to see, because I think there was some initial, they switched it around over the years,
Way
and then
back
finally
then.
everybody sort of caved, except for the two remaining.
So we actually have, so we've recorded this, so you'll have a copy of it.
Awesome.
And then, we'll send you their policy presentation, but we also have, 70 pages of
All my
all
data.
the
And you know,
data.
Trevor Potter is desperate to look at all of it. He was
Yeah.
so excited. He sent me a note just before I came. He said, I cannot wait. You have to just text me the second you get out of bed. So you guys have a lot of fans anxious to hear your report and a lot of support out there. So, I think you just did a fabulous job. And I hope you learned a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Very
definitely.
Great job, guys.
Yeah, excellent. Well done.
So we'll send